in a white paper that was authored by Satoshi Nakamoto as the technology underpinning Bitcoin. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto isn't actually a person as such. It's a pseudonym that protects the identity of one or many people. And we don't yet know for certain who that person or people are. Now, since Bitcoin was proposed in 2008, there have been many cryptocurrencies that have been released. Currently, it's around 6,000, the most notable of which are probably Ethereum, Litecoin, and Ripple, in addition to Bitcoin itself. So initially, most uses for blockchain were for financial transactions, and that is still probably the main use today, but a very wide range of applications were quickly identified, including the likes of supply chain tracking, anti-counterfeiting, digital ID handling, IoT device management, data sharing, auditing, and also the recordal of property ownership, which could be things like homes, but could also be things like intellectual property, like patents. Now, a blockchain is a distributed digital ledger that is effectively immutable by virtue of cryptographic techniques. What that means is that it's essentially a data store, a digital ledger. It is held by many different entities. That makes it distributed, and it keeps an effectively unalterable record of the information that gets entered into the data store. That's the immutable aspect. The distributed ledger requires no central control. Instead, it operates on a consensus model. Now, what that means is that information is added or accepted onto a blockchain by a range of participants all agreeing or forming a consensus that the information should be accepted and added to the record. That's in contrast to a central controlling authority where there's one authority that makes all decisions about information that can go onto the record. Now, there are fundamentally two different flavors of blockchain. There's permissionless and permissioned blockchain. The permissionless variety is such that anyone can read information on a blockchain and anyone can write to it. So anyone can start to be a read or write participant. With a permissioned blockchain, only entities that have permission to read or write data can do so. And that's quite significant for businesses that are adopting blockchain platforms, and we'll come on to that in a moment in the next slide. The final point that I want to make here is in relation to smart contracts, which is a piece of terminology that you hear quite often around blockchains when people are talking about blockchain. And they are effectively computer programs that operate sort of on top of a blockchain. They execute processes that can be triggered automatically by events that happen on the blockchain. So when particular pieces of information get entered into the record, then a smart contract can be set up to execute a particular process. And the outcome of that process might itself be re-entered back to the blockchain as a record of what has happened. So to take a look at the idea of this sort of distributed, no central controlling authority, we've got a graphic here that shows on the left the traditional central authority model. So this might be, for example, a bank that holds records or ledgers of all of the accounts at that bank. So if you want to pay someone else, for example, using your bank account, you have to instruct your bank that you would like to pay person B an amount of money. The bank checks that everything's in order in terms of your request, that you have the funds to make that transfer. They then contact the other person's bank. There's some interaction between the two banks. The transfer happens and person B is notified. In contrast, in a distributed system like blockchain, and in the middle we have a permissionless blockchain where anyone can join and anyone can read and write, when person A wants to make a transaction to pay person B, say 1 Bitcoin, they broadcast the transaction to all of the participants saying, this is person A's account. I want to transfer 1 Bitcoin to person B's account, and here's their account number. The participants will have a look at that transaction. They'll form a consensus about whether to accept it, and once it gets entered into the ledger, then that transaction has happened. There is no single authority that controls whether or not that transaction happens. It's formed by the group forming a consensus. A permissioned blockchain is very similar, but only authorized entities can participate. So you might set it up so that only authorized people can read and or write. What that means is, for businesses, is that if you have sensitive business information that you want to share with your partners or with different related businesses, but you don't want people generally accessing it because of its sensitivities, you can set up a permissioned blockchain and give access only to people who you are happy to see that information. So that's quite an important implementation detail as blockchain gets commercialized. So there have been many developments in the blockchain space over the last 13 years now, and the patent landscape changed significantly. So we'll start off by taking a quick look at the technology. And we've used what the Gartner hype cycle for this now. So Gartner hype cycle is something that some of you might have seen in the past. It's a piece of research that Gartner regularly produce, and they've done this a number of times over the years for blockchain. Unfortunately, I couldn't reproduce the actual hype cycle graphic here for copyright reasons, intellectual property getting in the way, unfortunately. But we've reproduced the most significant parts of the kind of technology space, in our opinion, so that we can talk through how it's changed over time. So the hype cycle, the idea is that it shows the progression of particular pieces of technology in terms of the expectation that that technology has as it evolves and as it matures. So the first stage is called the innovation trigger. As a technology develops and matures, then it moves into a level of higher expectations. And Gartner called this the peak of inflated expectations. And we saw cryptocurrencies like blockchain perhaps occupying this space around 2015, 2016, when it was felt that they would solve all the problems all at once. As time goes on, those expectations tend to go down until they reach a minimum. They hit the trough of disillusionment. And in 2019, that was where Gartner felt cryptocurrencies were. So this is where people felt that something had great prospects, but then a few years later, as things develop, you still have to realize those prospects and expectations. As it matures and develops further, those expectations start to increase again, and you move into the slope of enlightenment, and then the final stage that Gartner have is the plateau of productivity. So we've got a few particular areas of technology that relate to Bitcoin presented here. We've got zero knowledge proofs, which is a cryptographic technique of being able to prove that you know or have some information without actually disclosing that information. It's quite a significant area of cryptography. It has some really important applications, but it's also a very challenging area. In the next category, we have blockchain interoperability, which is essentially the ability of different blockchain technologies, different blockchain platforms to talk to each other. We also have consensus mechanisms, which I touched on earlier, and smart contracts. Finally, in the trough of disillusionment, we have cryptocurrencies. Now, Gartner very recently updated the hype cycle in 2021, and a few of these technologies moved. So cryptocurrencies went into the slope of enlightenment. consensus mechanisms and smart contracts also moved. And a new technology appeared straight into this peak of inflated expectations, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, which you've probably heard about in the press. Now, what's really interesting to note here is that some of the most difficult technology areas, zero-knowledge proofs, blockchain interoperability, haven't moved in those 2 years. Progress with those has been quite slow. But those areas are really technical areas. They're really core to blockchain. And they're probably the most patentable areas, potentially the most patentable areas that we have presented here. NFTs, in contrast, are really not particularly patentable. They utilize existing blockchain, existing aspects of blockchain without developing any of the core technology. They're really an application space of blockchain technology. And they've gone straight into the second category, having not appeared at all in 2019. So there's almost a correlation that we've observed between how quickly technologies can move through the hype cycle and how patentable they're likely to be. And with that, I'll move over to Raj now, who will talk us through some research that we've been conducting with the Swiss Patent Office into the landscape of blockchain patent filings.
Great, thank you, Phil. So we'll start off by looking at how the total number of patent families relating to blockchain technology has evolved over the last 10 years. So on this chart we have in front of us, the y-axis value for each year indicates the total number of blockchain-related patent families found on public record at the end of that year. And to clarify what we mean by a patent family, this is a group of pending or granted patent applications that share a priority claim and relate to similar technology. So we're really looking at patent applications that still have the potential to be granted as a patent or that have already been granted. So the first thing we notice here is this very steep increase in the number of published patent applications, starting at around 2017. And since patent applications typically publish around 18 months after their filing, this suggests quite a sudden increase in blockchain patent filings from around 2015. And if we think back to around this time, this was when blockchain really started to be seen for its value as a distributed trust infrastructure, having many other use cases away from cryptocurrency. The power of smart contracts was better understood, especially following the launch of Ethereum. And so we evidently see that a lot of patent applications started being filed around that time as the technology attracted investment from more technology firms and financial institutions. This acceleration in patent filings has pretty much gone on until the present day. But looking at the top of our curve here, you'll see that the numbers begin to level off a bit. This is primarily a symptom of our data only running through until March of this year. But at this point, I'll pass on to Mark, who's been independently conducting similar research and has some more recent numbers from this year. You're still on mute, Mark.
Okay, I got that snafu out of the way also. First, thank you, Raj. First, I will note that patent searching is, at least quantitatively, a very imprecise art. And I've done independent searching now for several years and updated every quarter, and have found the results of my search show a virtually identical profile to what we're seeing here of the rapid increase of filings and when that rapid increase occurred. However, my search has yielded in early October 2021 almost 40,000 patent families, significantly more. Now, that could be for many reasons based upon our search criteria. At least one reason I suspect is that my clients and I are very focused on decentralized applications, and my search has taken great pains to include decentralized applications, which may or may not be included in a blockchain focused search. So the point is that depending on the search criteria, we may find different quantitative numbers, but qualitatively, this profile matches the profile I found very well. And some of the additional data regarding some of the drill down data that Roger's going to show you in a moment also corresponds very closely with my search results.
Thanks, Mark. So next we'll have a look at where these patent families are most active around the world. So in particular, the countries that the patent applications in those families are being filed in, which of course shows where applicants are seeking to protect their blockchain innovations. So from this heat map in front of us, we almost immediately see that most of the patent applications are being filed in China by quite a significant margin. In fact, around 50% of the patent applications in our data set are Chinese applications. Second in the lead is the US, which accounts for around 15% of our data set, followed by South Korean, European, and Japanese applications. It's also worth noting that international applications make up around 9% of our data set, ranking third in terms of the top application type. These will, of course, eventually enter into individual countries as national applications, but the presence of these international applications does show that there are applicants that may be seeing value in protecting blockchain innovations on a wider scale outside of China and the US, where there seems to be most activity in protecting blockchain innovations. And if we compare this to the next slide, so here if we look at where the inventions in those patent applications are being invented, we do see a similar story. So on the chart on the left, we see that a huge number of patent families in our data set relate to inventions conceived in China, again indicating heavy activity there. US and South Korea again follow, but again at quite a distance. But from the graph on the right, you'll see, if you look close enough, that China didn't always lead in terms of the numbers. So our data indicates that up until around 2016, 2017, the US was most active in blockchain innovation, but we see a quicker and more aggressive reaction in China coming out of 2015 and 2016 in comparison to the US and South Korea. And this is likely a reaction to the various endorsements and incentives that the Chinese government put in place around 2016 to support Chinese companies innovating in blockchain. And I'll pass again here to Mark, who's been able to spot similar trends from his data.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say about this dominance, if you will, of filings out of China and in China. Number one, this presents a problem with identification and searching of prior art, or at least a difficulty. And one thing related to that, my search originally showed this rise of filings out of China as coming significantly later than your search, coming around 2018. I suspect that is based upon the prior art issue that I'm alluding to. I'll get to it, tell you about it now. Many of these patent applications were at least originally published only in the Chinese language. And most of the search tools, including those that I use, are focused on Western languages and English in particular. And I think this huge amount of filings that are in the Chinese language only, at least for a time before they are translated and published in other countries, in Western countries. But this huge mass of prior art, and possibly significant prior art, is going to be very difficult to search, and it's going to present problems for us. I also think that, at least in part, again, this dominance in the numbers from China are driven by those incentives that Raj just alluded to. And so, to some extent, it may be a little bit of quantity over quality, and the dominance may not be as high as it looks. And I think some of the data you're going to discuss actually confirms that a bit.
Yeah, that's right. So with the research that we conducted with the Swiss Patent Office, the Swiss Patent Office have a way of attributing a notional value to patent applications and patents. And they do this essentially for every patent application in the world. We then had a look at the most valuable, the top 10% of patent applications. And within that data set, we looked to see how many of those relate to blockchain. And this is what's represented here. So these are essentially the most valuable blockchain patent applications and patents. And what we see that's really interesting, if I return to the previous slide, is that the reduction in the number of filings is probably not as much as you would think. So if we're looking at only the top 10%, and if the distribution of value of blockchain-related applications were about the same as an average technology, you'd expect the numbers here to go down by about a factor of 10. So China would go down from about 15,000 to 1,500. But actually what we see is that it goes down to about 4,000. So that's a reduction of what, about 75%, not a reduction of 90%. And the US, that's more pronounced still. We go down from about 3,000, just over 3,000, to about 1,700, 1,800. So roughly half. So the gap between the US and China closes. China's still well ahead, but the gap has closed a lot. So I think that really supports what Mark was saying about that there are a number, there is a larger proportion of lower value applications in the Chinese part of the data set. But there is still actually a very large number of valuable blockchain applications and blockchain patents. And I think that's a really important point in demonstrating the maturity, well, the maturing nature of blockchain filings and the value that those patent applications have. This is the final part of our research with the Swiss office, and I'll hand back to Rajan to talk us through this.
Thanks, Phil. So we'll have a look at which companies are actually investing in developing and patenting blockchain technology. So here we have the top 50 patent filers from our data set of blockchain-related patent families. Looking at the top 5, China's dominance is again very obvious, given that 4 of the top 5 companies are China-based. But we do see diversity in the types of companies that are seeking to project blockchain innovations. We, of course, have a lot of financial institutions like Ant Financial at our #1 spot. MasterCard, Visa, various banks also feature further down the list. Companies like Tencent and Alibaba are obviously big in the e-commerce space. You also find your more classic tech names feature throughout the list, like IBM, Dell, Microsoft. But you will also find smaller tech firms that specialize in blockchain technology, like nChain. A lot of Chinese universities and research institutions also feature in this list, which is probably a symptom of the government incentives there. But overall, this does tell us that there's a range of companies across the tech ecosystem that see value in developing and patenting blockchain technology, likely due to its wide scope of application. One example I'd like to pick out is that Walmart feature in this list, which is a retailer in the US who've been working with IBM to develop blockchain-based food tracing system. And so I find that they're a pretty good case study for how blockchain technology can be used outside of cryptocurrency. I'll again pass to Mark for comment on how his research in this area compares.
Sure. So this matches very closely the players that I found also be dominating. But I'll make a couple notes and underscore what you said, Raj, about the diversity of the group here. Because blockchain is a technology and not really an industry, we're seeing a very diverse group, players from legacy technology companies, big financial companies, retailers, and if you went down this list further, you'd see a lot of little small blockchain startups and various other parties. You also mentioned nChain, and I wanted to point out a few facts about nChain. So the founder of nChain is a person named Craig Wright, who is very controversial in blockchain circles, if you will. He is claimed to be the person behind that pseudonym that we mentioned earlier, Satoshi Nakamoto. He's claimed to be the inventor, if you will, of blockchain. Many people doubt his claim. He started nChain, and to my knowledge, their activity has focused very much on obtaining patents as opposed to developing new technology. I'm not aware of any particular services that they're providing, but they have hundreds of patent applications. As you see here, almost 200 patent families filed in many different jurisdictions. And they've made many claims that they will use their patents to promote the Bitcoin Cash blockchain and to steer where the technology goes. I suspect that they will be what's referred to as a non-practicing entity, or sometimes more pejoratively called a patent troll. In other words, a party that invests in patents for a return on investment through those patents. So they could be, in my opinion, problematic for many of the innovators in this space in the near future.
So I think that leads us nicely on to our slides relating to the actual patenting of blockchain technologies and the various considerations there. Perhaps, Mark, if you could continue and sort of talk us through a little bit about the considerations here generally around blockchain patenting.
Do you want me to kind of go over this summary here, or should I jump in? Are you asking me to jump into the US practice?
Perhaps if you just go through this, and I can talk about the European practice.
Okay.
I mean, you have a
Okay,
few.
I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused. So yeah, my apologies again. I think, so it's clear that there are thousands of patent families related to blockchain, and several thousand granted patents already, all related directly to blockchain. And one thing I wanted to underscore that I don't think we've mentioned, the study that we've discussed today and my studies are focused specifically on blockchain and don't include general cryptographic patents and networking patents and other things that very well could affect developers and innovators in blockchain technology, but aren't directly related to blockchain. Given the immaturity of this technical field, we're seeing a lot of sort of proverbial land grabs, different parties trying to stake out proprietary space in different aspects of blockchain technology. And I think again, in my opinion, it's very clear that this is going to lead to significant patent litigation. We have highly increasing number of patents, increasing commercial use of the technology, and parties in many different industries who are not used to competing with each other and running into each other. And I think we could very well see the kind of patent litigation that we saw 10 and 15 years ago in the telecom space and the mobile handset space in particular. And I recall there are several famous infographics about the patent wars that we saw in the telecom space. And they're really, what they look like was there were about 30 players and hundreds of lines between each of these players indicating the various patent cases that, which they had going against each other. And we could very well see that in the blockchain space. And I would say that that kind of excess of patent litigation is not a good thing. Now, many people say, well, telecom has certainly innovated over the past 10 years, and I think we can't deny that. But if you look at handset manufacturers, for example, there are really only 3 parties developing mobile handsets, or at least 3 kind of dominant parties developing mobile handsets right now. And I would suggest that that space may be even more innovative had there been a larger group of parties developing handsets. And I'm really referring to, I guess it's maybe 4 or 5, Samsung, Apple, Google and some of the other Android manufacturers, but very few. So I think there's going to be a lot of litigation unless it's managed. I think that's not healthy. And I think, as noted by my comments on N-chain earlier, we could very well see a lot of NPE activity, particularly as we see the usual cycle of startups who stake out space and then fail, sell their patents to litigate, they get picked up by not practicing entities, and you know, that kind of feeds that whole cycle. So lots of patents, potentially lots of patent litigation.
Yeah, great. And so when we're considering patenting, it's important to consider the approach taken in different patent offices. And so we'll start by just considering the EPO's approach. The EPO have been very clear that blockchain will be examined by them in exactly the same way as any computer implemented invention. And that's a process that they have been carrying out for many years now. And this slide visually summarizes the fundamentals of that approach. So we have the features that are being claimed within the blue oval. We have features disclosed in the closest prior art in the green circle. And then we have this horizontal line, above which are features that have technical character and below which are features that have non-technical character. Now, the features that are below that horizontal line make no technical contribution. And so in the EPO's assessment, they cannot contribute to inventive step. The features that overlap with the closest prior art are not novel, and so they can't contribute to inventive step. And so we have left, when we consider those two areas that can't help us to obtain a patent, we have the highlight area with the red hatching. So once those features are identified, the EPO asks the final question, are those features obvious or not? If they are obvious, then a patent will not be granted. If they are non-obvious, then a patent will be granted. So whenever you're filing a patent application in Europe, it's important to have features in your claims that are not disclosed in the closest prior art, that contribute to a technical effect, that contribute to the technical character of the invention, and that are non-obvious. Now, the EPO doesn't have a complete definition of what technical character means, but I've given some examples here of some effects, some benefits that I think the EPO would consider to be technical and that are relevant to blockchain. So one is features that result in a lower power consensus mechanism. You might have seen in the press over the years articles about the huge power consumption that's attributed to Bitcoin mining. And Bitcoin mining is essentially the Bitcoin consensus process. So if you can develop a new consensus process that is just as secure but consumes less power, then that is likely to be considered technical at the EPO. Likewise, developments that improve the interoperability of blockchains are likely to be considered technical. Also, things that reduce the amount of data transmission that takes place between parties, or that secures that data transmission process more robustly, or improves the stability of retention of data within the blockchain records. So that might include things like countermeasures against tampering of that data, or just generally improved cryptographic processes. I've got a couple of examples as well of things that are unlikely to be considered technical by the EPO and are therefore likely to be patent ineligible. One of those is just the use of existing standard blockchains in a particular business setting, a particular business application. So applying without any modification a standard blockchain platform, your particular business process is very unlikely to be patent eligible in Europe. Likewise, the straightforward automation of existing human processes using standard blockchain platforms is also unlikely to be patent eligible in Europe. So I'll hand back to Mark now to talk us through how the US Patent and Trademark Office considers blockchain applications.
So the concept of what we call patent eligibility in the US, which is the threshold issue of what type of innovation can actually be patented, to say that there is a great deal of uncertainty with respect to patent eligibility these days in the US Patent Office is a tremendous understatement. Up until a few years back, I think many of us in the patent community would have said that software-based innovations are more easily patented in the US Patent Office than in other major offices, particularly the EPO. However, about 10 years ago, the US Supreme Court held that financial transactions and financial relationships implemented by software were merely an abstract idea that was not patent eligible, could not be patented. And the lower courts, in particular the Patent Office, have taken this holding and run with it to where there's a rejection based upon patent eligibility in virtually all software-based inventions, applications directed to software-based inventions that are filed in the US Patent Office. Now, many times we can overcome this rejection, but it's something we deal with constantly. The US courts and Patent Office have said over and over again throughout the years that there is no technical character or technical effect standard in the US Patent Office as there is in the EPO. However, pragmatically, there really is a technical effects standard. What we're seeing is that most patent examiners will say that anything implemented by software is really just an abstract idea, and that in order to demonstrate patent eligibility of this abstract idea, of the software innovation, it must be integrated into a practical application. That's the standard articulated by the US Patent Office, which means that it must be technical in character. It has to improve the operation of a computer or actually transform an article. So again, we are actually seeing, while there's no legal technical effects standard, we're seeing a technical effects standard being applied. And in some art units, well, let me back up a little bit. The US Patent Office, one of the first things they'll do with a patent application is classify it in a technological category and then assign it to a group of examiners called a group art unit. Some of these group art units have over 90% rejection rates based mostly on this patent eligibility issue, particularly the business methods art unit. And so classification can be critical because while some have a 90% rejection rate, some have a 70% approval rate. And I'll give you an example. Recently filed a patent application for a client, and the patent application is directed at a high level to cross-chain transactions, financial transactions that go from a blockchain of one protocol to a blockchain of another protocol. It's a big problem. How do you exchange Ether for Bitcoin, for example? And this client has innovated to address that issue. But instead of characterizing this as a cross-chain financial transaction, if you read this application, it looks very much like a messaging protocol between disparate computing networks. We characterize it very much as a technical innovation as opposed to a financial innovation. And that has become, again, a critical practice in the USPTO because of this patent eligibility issue and how different art units handle that issue.
Yeah, and I think we actually see similar at the EPO as well now. I recently had the misfortune of encountering an examiner with a 0 90% grant rate. So
we have some of those too.
Yeah, that wasn't much fun. So just to wrap things up, it's worth considering just a few sort of key points. And I think for me, the real takeaway points here are that a lot of blockchain technology developments are difficult and they take a long time. But those difficult, really technical developments are the most likely to be patent eligible. And those patents could well be very high value. They could be to really fundamental aspects of blockchain technology in the future. And we're already seeing a lot of very valuable patent applications and granted patents worldwide. And I think where there are valuable granted patents in a rapidly developing technology area, with the potential for litigation becomes quite high as well. And I think that anyone operating in this area just needs to be aware of that potential in the future so that they're not caught by surprise. I think, and Mark, perhaps you have some final thoughts as well.
Yes, I do. I've been, to underscore the point you just made, I've been accused of crying wolf now for about 5 years about the potential for excessive patent litigation, particularly in the US because of the inefficient system we have here for years now. And I've often been asked, well, are you aware of any patent litigation directed to blockchain technology? And up until recently, my answer has been no, I'm not aware of any litigation. But I've always said that's because there are relatively few patents as compared to more mature technologies. And there's a relatively low amount of revenue flowing through the implementations. There's not a lot of commercial implementations. And imagine 4 or 5 years ago, that was really true. And it's since then, the number of patents is beginning to increase, as you've seen. The number of commercial implementations is increasing. And sure enough, in the last 8 months or so, we've seen 17 patent litigations related to blockchain technology pop up on the radar. And I think this is going to increase tremendously as, again, the number of patents and the number of commercial implementations increases. Also, I think the revival of the, I hope I don't overstate this, but the revival of the potential for the unitary patent, European unitary patent and unified patent court will make another very large market for litigation, and we will see continued litigation, increase in litigation in the US, in Europe, and I think possibly in China.
Great. So I think, technology problems. We can move on to some questions. We have about 10 minutes left, so hopefully that will be enough time for us to get through the questions.